Welcome to another episode of our Heritage Walkabout. And so I am Anil Chitrakar, and what I want to do is basically tell the story of our heritage, which is globally unique, with the hope that this heritage, which needs many people to help and lend their hands and support to conserve, will understand these sites much better, so that we can all join to preserve, protect, manage these sites for many centuries to come. So welcome to one of these globally unique water systems. So one thing each one of us needs to remember is that in the history of the world, there have been thousands of cities that were designed, they were planned, they were built, and because they forgot how the water system worked, the city became an archaeological site and then ultimately died as a city. And then people then move on to build other cities. So one of the most unique aspects of Patan and the city that we're walking through is the fact that these systems have been working for nearly 1300 years. Kathmandu Valley is shaped like a bowl, and so it is surrounded by hills, and all the hills are afforested or they have forest cover. So the slope of the hills, which have the forest and the trees, they act like a sponge. So when it rains during the months of June, July, August and September, the trees act like a sponge and they store the water, and then at the base of the watershed, the springs break out and the water comes via canals into the city, and it gets distributed through these stone water fountains. And so the whole city of Patan, as well as other cities in the Kathmandu Valley, are all served by these amazing water conduits and stone water spouts. So what we need to understand is that for thousands of years, and so if you look at this Mahabodha area of Patan, it is about 1300 years old, maybe 1400 years old, and so there are very few places in the world where the water has been flowing continuously for almost 1300 years because of this system, and this is why the city continues to be a thriving city. So one thing we should also notice is the iconography on these stone spouts. And so if you look at the animal, so it could be partly a crocodile, it could partly be an elephant, but in totality we call it the Hiti Monga or the Makara. And so what we need to understand is that it represents the water spirit. Now if you look at the animal and if you look at the tail, you can see that it evolves into waves of the flowing rivers. The other thing we need to notice is that you will see very often three animals depicted. So there is a mongoose, there is a frog, and there is a snake. And so what we've been told always, and we can see this in the system, is that the tadpoles breed, the frogs come up, the snakes go to eat the frogs, and the mongoose goes in to eat the snakes. So this movement of the frogs, the snakes and the mongoose is what has kept the system going for thousands of years. And so once we disrupt this movement, then the drains get clogged, and once the drain gets clogged, then you have inundation, and so this is a huge challenge in maintaining these systems. So these are amazing water systems, but you will notice that this particular one at Sauga is quite deep, and so in Newari we call them Ga Hiti, or basically depressions in the ground or a hole in the ground, and you can see the water is flowing very well right now. And the beauty of these systems is that the water is flowing very well, but the steps are too many. And so the story we have in this part of the town is that a friend, a businessman, built this Hiti and then invited many friends for a feast to inaugurate this tap. And then what happens is one friend boycotted this ceremony or this feast, and basically said, what kind of tap have you built? Where do you have to climb so many steps down, and then with the water, you have to climb so many steps up. And so these two friends basically competed to see who could build a stone tap that was closer to the ground. So it is little wonder that we don't see this particular tap being used as the other taps, because the distance you have to traverse is quite high. Now, one thing we also should remember, as we mentioned, is that all this system works on gravity. Today, unfortunately, we have a system that encourages the use of a diesel pump, which you want to replace, every 3-4 months, and then also the need to burn and procure more diesel every day. And so this thinking, where once you build something that can function for thousands of years, versus things that will, not work after 3 months, but also require daily input of diesel or petrol into them. And so in the debate about sustainability, there is a lot that these systems can teach us. And so for those politicians who say Nepal only has hills and mountains, and so we cannot develop the country, they should learn that this entire system works on gravity. And so how to use gravity as a friend and as a power, for development is something that everybody can learn, from these. So one of the challenges, in building these spouts is that it basically reflects the state of the watershed, which means, how much trees there are, but then also the sponging effect of those trees. And so the people who have built, tall houses, they really need to realize that the sand and the stone mining that they do in the watershed is basically reducing the capacity of the watershed to store the monsoon rain. And so when there is not enough storage, then the springs tend to dry up. And then once the springs dry up, then the amount of water that flows through these taps is basically reduced. So one thing we have to learn is basically that our actions in the city, and the way we source materials for our construction, can adversely affect, how much water we get ultimately for our homes. And so something that we have to, keep in mind. So the reason that local people believe, that this particular tap is gilded in gold is because it is so easy for people to get the water because it is so close to the ground level. Now, if you talk in terms of an engineering, aspect, then basically if you look at the canal that brings the water in, so it is only a few centimeters to a kilometer that it depresses. And so one thing is that, when they were built, they did not think that the canals could be disrupted or people might pump water, out of the canals. And so by the time it reaches the city, it is much reduced. But if you are a jury and you were asked to judge, which of these taps should have a gold medal, and if the criteria was how many steps you need to climb down to get the water, then you can see why this one, would get, the first prize.